Welcome to H20LA, an examination of Louisiana's relationship with water. I'm Michael Martin. I'm the director of the Center for Louisiana Studies, and it's my pleasure to give you a general introduction to today's symposium. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. First, a few housekeeping notes. If you have one of these things, please mute it or go ahead and turn it off. Probably be good not only for the symposium, but also for your mental health. Otherwise, try to keep disruptions at a minimum. If you need a restroom, the restrooms are located down and to the left. There's a hallway down there. There is coffee and water, although there is a sign on the door outside that says, please no food or drink in this room. With those things out of the way, I want to say that today's symposium is a part of a series that the Center for Louisiana Studies began a few years ago to study and discuss major problems and issues confronting our state today. The first of that series was held in the aftermath of the Grand Theater 16 shooting. It looked at gun violence in Louisiana. Our second symposium focused on women in Louisiana. Today, though, we turn attention to what in some ways is the reason that the place we call Louisiana even exists historically, and to what is the source of much of our economic, social, and cultural life, and yet is also, without a doubt, the most potentially threatening, even devastating element of our landscape, and that is water. Before we get to the discussions, I'd like to thank our sponsors. The Center for Louisiana Studies could not have done this alone, particularly without the generous financial support of the UL Lafayette College of Liberal Arts, the Jamie and Thelma Gilbo Charitable Trust, the Haney Family Foundation, and the Atchafalaya National Heritage Area. Beyond that, I'd like to thank AOC Community Media for filming today's symposium and making it available soon on its TV and YouTube channels. Finally, I'd like to personally thank Jennifer Guidry, over here, the Center for Louisiana Studies Assistant Director for Programming and Special Projects, and Dr. Liz Skilton, over here, an Assistant Professor of History here at UL Lafayette, for taking what was just an idea and turning it into a reality. Jennifer and Liz oversaw the entire process from the call for proposals to procurement of this wonderful facility at the Louisiana Immersive Technologies Enterprise to arranging for publicity and promotions. And they did it efficiently and effectively. In short, they brought together a remarkable program of scholars and observers, folks who I feel lucky to share this microphone with. I'll now hand the microphone over to Dr. Skilton, who as program chair will provide some further opening remarks.
Good morning, all. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you today to the Center for Louisiana Studies' annual symposium on water, an examination of Louisiana's relationship with it and how we try and deal with it historically. As stated in the program, I'm going to provide a brief introduction to our program today and then present our first session of the day. I will try to give a brief overview of the purpose of each session before it begins, as well as introduce each of the speakers. Following the speaker presentations, we will open up the session for question and answer from the audience, time permitting. Before I get started, I wanted to be sure and mention that we do have an exciting lineup of speakers today, as well as a variety of exhibits on display in the lobby. In between sessions, I encourage you to check out Brandon Ballinger's portable Gulf of Mexico Biodiversity Museum, as well as the Lafayette, or University of Lafayette, University of Louisiana at Lafayette Department of History's 2016 Flood Community History Harvest Maps from the Lafayette and Baton Rouge areas, created with the assistance from the Water Institute of the Gulf and students from the UL Lafayette Public History Program. Now to begin. The rain came down lightly at first, darkening the sky with each drop. Then, with a whoosh, it picked up, beating at the roofs, rushing the sewers, and banging the shutters. But it was not the rain that was frightening. It was the water that followed and wouldn't recede. Increasing from one night and into the next, it flowed freely through the streets and whirled furiously near the storm drains, subverting carefully laid out city plans in Louisianans' efforts to control their natural surroundings. Within 3 days, the ground was swollen, thoroughly seeped with the swell of excess the sky had produced, and over 146,000 homes lay underwater in a new modern-day version of Atlantis. When it stopped, the world remained quiet as the residents surveyed their damaged surroundings, pumping water from their doorsteps and houses as they yet again picked up their lives. Louisianans had suffered before, but rarely just due to rain. Thus, they struggled with what they should call this $10 to $15 billion disaster. At the moment, it had no name. It was simply called a rain event. But the term rain event was a poor summation of the horror associated with the catastrophic imagery as broadcast live on social media, particularly the images of families displaced across the southern half of the state, the execution of relief efforts by state, local, and volunteer organizations on par with large-scale hurricanes, and the debate over the reasons for the extent of flooding within Louisiana's longer history of arm wrestling nature. As a result, Louisianans toyed with multiple labels, hoping one might sound right. They could call it a 100-year flood, maybe, but that might be too unclear in that there had been multiple 100-year floods within 100 years in state history. The Louisiana floods was also a possibility, but it was confusing given the floods within the last year in the northern region of the state. The Acadiana floods, but it wasn't just Acadiana that was affected. The 2016 floods. A little bit better than the others, but even so, did it accurately describe the impact of this event had in the long term, or nationally and even internationally, when looking at it as connected to larger discussions of climate and coastal change, extreme weather events, and even federal disaster relief standards? This was a new nightmare added to the list of those from the past, interconnected to all that came before, and for today, we'll simply call it the floods. I spent the weekend collecting community interviews on the 2016 floods in both Lafayette and Baton Rouge, and one of the interview questions we asked the community members was, what do you call this event? I got many responses. Many of them appear in the text that I just read to you, but one response in particular sticks out in my mind. He said, you don't want to know what I call this event. It's not appropriate, it's not PC, I don't want to be recorded saying it. And I thought that was a pretty good summation of this feeling that we have in reference to the floods and in reference to every disaster that we experience through time. This question of a name is something that we wrestle with. And as we go through history and experience more disasters, we come up with new names for old disasters. We call them something different. When I was asked by the Center for Louisiana Studies to put together this year's symposium, I knew immediately that it would have to focus on these floods and Louisiana's complex relationship with water in context. As a Louisianan in 2017 and an environmental historian, I can think of no other subject that plays such a critical role in shaping the future of Louisiana. 2017 has been a pivotal year for decisions related to water, from our reconciling the effects of the 2016 floods to the reverberating panic that hits with the release of the new coastal master plan, showing even greater land loss than expected, to the declaration of Louisiana as the site of the first climate refugees in the nation, and even the continued downturn of an oil market that is linked to the water we are surrounded by. All of this shaped and shapes our relationship with and our perspective on water. Today's sessions delve into this complex relationship with water in a myriad of ways. They have been carefully chosen to highlight specific themes and to represent the broad disciplinary efforts underway to study its impact on our state. Some of the presenters are what you would call traditional scholars from universities across the state and outside of the state. Others are scholars from non-university affiliated professions who are here to share their expertise on everything from industry to policy. At the conclusion of our day, we are pleased to feature renowned historian John M. Barry as our keynote speaker, who wrote the book on another major flood and its repercussions of flood management concerns. Our first session today is entitled Living in Water and discusses Louisianans' epic history of the war on water. For over 300 years, Louisianans have sought to remove water, manage, or control it, or live within it. Featured in this panel are a historian, a geographer, and a biologist. And before everyone thinks that this is an outlandish mishmash of scholars, let me remind you that the majority of Louisiana is and continues to be below sea level, thus faces unique challenges in coping with water. These scholars will discuss how Louisianans negotiate this salty territory in the past and the present. Now, to introduce our speakers for the first session. Kraig E. Colton has spent 30 years researching topics in environmental historical geography with a focus on water. His recent books include the award-winning An Unnatural Metropolis, Wrestling New Orleans from Nature, published in 2005, and Perilous Place in Powerful Storms, Hurricane Protection in Coastal Louisiana, published in 2009. His most recent book, Southern Waters, The Limits to Abundance, published in 2014, contrasts the historical approach to water as an unlimited resource in the American South and the complications produced by emerging shortages due to human activity. He currently works on projects related to community resilience and adaptation to changing environmental conditions in coastal Louisiana. Rebecca Costas graduated from LSU with her PhD in history in December 2016. Her dissertation, Policies of Loss, Coastal Erosion, and the Struggle to Save Louisiana's Wetlands, examined the politics and policies of coastal erosion and coastal restoration between the early 1970s and 2009. She recently had a short article published on the Organization of American Historians' Process blog that discussed how land use policies exacerbated the impacts of Hurricane Katrina in 2005. She is currently working on revising her dissertation into a manuscript that focuses on 3 major phases of coastal restoration policies in Louisiana. And last but not least, Beth Stauffer is an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. Her lab conducts research on phytoplankton ecology in estuaries of South Louisiana and beyond. And she is active in research on water quality in coastal and inland ecosystems. Stauffer holds her bachelor's degree in marine science and biology from the University of Miami and her doctorate from the University of Southern California. Prior to joining the UL Lafayette faculty, she completed postdoctoral training at Columbia University and as an AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in Washington, D.C. Please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Kraig Colton.
Good morning. It looks like it got me hidden behind. I'm not tall enough to stand above this like I would like to, but that's just, my mother kept telling me when I was a child that could expect, when I was in high school, I could expect another growth spurt. I'm still waiting. That was in the 1970s. But the topic today is water. And I think we all know that Louisiana and Louisiana residents take great pride in the fact that we proclaim to be sportsman paradise, and much of that derives from our abundance of water. We have wetlands for fishing and for hunting, but Louisiana's water geography also adds a dimension of danger, which we've all come to know and be aware of. We have flooding from rivers, we have hurricane surge, we have a disappearing coastline and rising sea level. And because we've seen our fair share of recent disasters, I'd like to propose that we change the name of our, there goes my, I'd like to propose that we change the name of our state slogan from Sportsman Paradise to State of Disaster. Louisiana has had its fair share of disasters, and disasters as federally designated formal designations. This chart shows a rise since we had a policy that enabled the creation of disaster declarations, and we've seen a relatively steady increase. The 2010, this is by decade, not the year, and so we will still have more declarations in the balance of this decade. We might not surpass the 2000, but we still have seen many disasters. And disasters are basically events where society is overwhelmed, We tend to think of disasters as natural events, and the journalists always talk about natural disasters. Yet there's over 30 years of good scholarship that says, well, there are no natural disasters. Disasters are the result of society being overwhelmed. That is, we're underprepared and unable to respond effectively to some extreme natural event or actually a technological event. So I'd like us to set aside that notion of natural disasters. We can talk about disasters, yes, but disasters are the intersection between extreme events and human decisions. A society that experiences frequent disasters tends to build up a repository of knowledge and wisdom about how to respond and overcome and rebuild and rebound after a disastrous event. And a resilient society is one that does those things, that is capable of effective and efficient rebound. And a resilient society is one that actually reduces an extreme event from a disaster to a mere disruption. And I think that's how we need to approach these extreme events. How can we prepare for them so that they're not disastrous, that they are mere disruptions? And one way to think about this is this is a graphic prepared back in the 1970s by a guy named a geographer named Robert Cates and some of his colleagues. And it points out these various stages of how society responds to an extreme event. We have the emergency phase, which is a very short, immediate after event where you go out and rescue people. Then you have the restoration where you restore power and the basic functions of society. But the big part of this, the big part of how a society responds is really what he calls the two stages of reconstruction, or the short-term and long-term recovery. And I want to focus on recovery here today. Recovery, as he points out, each of these stages, he points out, tends to be 10 times longer than the preceding one. You have 10 days of emergency. You can have 100 days of restoration, 1,000 days of the first phase of recovery, and 10,000 of the longer stage. So what this means is recovery is the most significant, oftentimes the most costly part of coping with a disastrous situation, with an extreme event. And yet we tend to invest more in the emergency phase. We tend to invest in, we have emergency agencies. We don't have long-term recovery agencies. We tend not to have long-term recovery plans. Yet this tends to be the most prominent part of dealing with extreme events. So my question here today is, how effective have we been at incorporating the lessons learned from the many disasters we've experienced so that we mitigate the impact, so that we enable more effective response, that we transform these events from disasters to disruptions? This is more of a cartoon than an actual graphic, but it attempts to show that we are experiencing overlapping recoveries, particularly here in this latter stage. The coastal crisis, which I'll talk about, is one that's going on. This is a recovery. We're trying to execute a recovery in the midst of the crisis. The peaks of these graphs show kind of the peak expenditure of dollars in the aftermath of Katrina and Rita, Gustav and Ike, the BP oil spill, the oil price plummeting, and then the 2016 floods, which we're just still really in the early stages of. I will really focus on Baton Rouge rather than the Vermilion River floods when I talk about these floods, but it's because I live there, I've done work in this, but they are part of this bigger story. But what's important here to know is that we are still very much in the throes of recovery of all these events. None of them is fully past, even Katrina. And what's important here is that when you have overlapping recoveries, it creates competition for resources, it adds stress, and it complicates each successive recovery. And we've had our fair share of these events in recent years. Now, I'm going to talk about four major water disasters or classes of disasters, really looking at several specific ones. We'll talk about the hurricanes between 1915 and 2005, the oil spills since the 1930s, major offshore oil spills since the 1930s, inland flooding from the 1920s to 2016, we're really focusing on 2016, and then our official state crisis, the coastal crisis, that's been going well documented since the 1950s. If we look at hurricane flooding in New Orleans, and again, I'm going to focus here because most of my work has been in this area. This graphic shows flooding in New Orleans after the 1915 hurricane, after the 1947 hurricane, after Betsy in '65, and after Katrina in 2005. And what's really important here is that areas along the lakefront were flooded in each and every one of those events. Okay? How did New Orleans respond to that? And did they incorporate lessons learned for dealing with hurricanes? If we look at the flood print after the first flood event, New Orleans built this seawall. It created new land here and actually created a fortification, a structural barrier to hurricane flooding from Lake Pontchartrain. But what that did is that encouraged development. It created what some geographers call the Levee Effect. You build a levee and people move in behind it. But all levees have a design limit. They're not designed to protect against every flood, but it floods up to a certain level. But still, they encourage development and residential activity, commercial activity behind them. And so people move into harm's way, in effect. By the 1950s, this area was heavily populated, the lakefront area. When the 1947 floods came, some of that same area was flooded again. If we look at the flood print from Betsy in 1965, this hasher line shows the area that was flooded. After Betsy, the most rapid residential development in the city was both out in Jefferson Parish, but also, and this just shows development in Orleans Parish, the number of new subdivisions permitted between 1969 and 72, each of these little circles, was very aggressive in the footprint of the 1965 flood. People immediately began building in those areas. Granted, they built a new levee system to protect people. So there was mitigation and structural protection, but people immediately moved in to that area. And actually, the expenditures on the levees was justified by the fact that there would be development to offset to balance the cost-benefit analysis. But we see development in the floodplain again. A different kind of map here, but this shows, once again, the gray area shows the area that was flooded by Betsy or by Katrina in 2005. And each of these little colored rectangles represents an area that was targeted by the city for redevelopment in the post-Betsy or post-Katrina era. Only one of those was outside the flood footprint. Now, granted, these areas that were flooded were the ones who needed the most recovery dollars, but the most aggressive development was back into harm's way. Certain modifications were made to the levee system. They closed the outfall canals. They built a surge barrier. Mr. Go was close. So there were structural modifications and improvements made. But the basic point here is the lesson learned was if you build in flood's way, you can expect to get flooded in the future, but they tended to ignore that lesson. And so overall, we see in the post-Katrina era, the recovery, and this is a point that I didn't really make here, but the recovery was delayed by the fact that there was no recovery plan in place when Katrina made landfall. We've seen redevelopment in the footprint of the flood, which means you have people exposed to hazard in the future. And partly as a consequence of the absence of a recovery plan, Katrina's recovery still goes on. And I show Charity Hospital here because they only started really gutting that earlier this year. If we look at historical oil spills, the other part of this, the second part of this, we've had a series of onshore oil spills well before the 1950s. We had a series well, there was a major oil spill in the 1930s in Lake Pelto, which was the first really big documented offshore oil spill that created a long-standing court case. And then again, in the early 1970s, there were two major offshore oil spills, bigger than the Santa Barbara spill in 1969, which caused fatalities, caused closing of moratoriums on offshore oil drilling temporarily, much like the BP spill. But as a result of those spills in the 70s, And also the Santa Barbara spill, we had federal laws passed that required a little bit more careful monitoring and preparation for oil spills. And we now have this database that shows all the oil spills, and we have thousands of oil spills off the Louisiana coast and onshore. Most of these spills are fairly small, and we're very effective at dealing with those. But if you look at what happened with the BP spill, we had a spill that was far larger than those thousands of spills that we respond to very effectively. This, of course, tragically killed 11 workers, some 205 million gallons of oil spewed into the Gulf, and over the course of nearly 3 months, 87 days, and it oiled some 665 miles of coastline in Louisiana. This was really a tragic event, no question about it. But what we see in the oil spill response and recovery is there are a number of unmet needs. There was not adequate emergency equipment in place. The various organizations, the consortiums of oil companies and drilling companies to maintain adequate response equipment had been neglected and really wasn't fully up to capacity. We also saw a failure of capacity to scale up to a large event. Even our emergency planning drills didn't envision a spill anywhere near this magnitude, and the planning and preparation was for much smaller events. So we couldn't scale up to an event of this size. The emergency response and drill or well closure technology had not kept pace with the drilling technology in deep water, and basically they employed the same techniques they'd employed in Santa Barbara in 1969 and the Ixtoc well in Mexico in the 1970s. And once again, there was no long-term recovery plan in place. And of course, the BP recovery still continues here 7 years later. If we shift to inland flooding, and I'll talk about the Ameet River Basin, which is a fairly small basin just east of Baton Rouge, and you can see it here. And in 1985, the floodplain manager for the basin made a really interesting and very prescient comment. He said he was talking about an imaginary flood in a few years from 1985. He says that is the disaster that doesn't have to happen. And he said that because he said we could avoid a disaster with sensible planning and actually following through on planning efforts to avoid development in flood risk zones and to invest in mitigation. Now, granted, we did invest some money in mitigation. They began work on the Comeet River Diversion Canal, which is incomplete for a variety of reasons. But this basin is one that is incredibly prone to flooding. The red line shows the flood stage. The blue lines above that red line show that over 30 flood events, or at least a foot over the flood stage, between 1983 and between 1973 and 2016. We had additional rain events with over 20 inches of rain with Hurricane Allison or Tropical Storm Allison in 2001. We had flooding with Gustav in 2008, and we had 2 floods in the basin in 2016, in the spring and again in the fall. Floods are no strangers here. Louisiana, and this area in particular, is one of the areas with the highest number of repeat flood claims in the country. One community in the Ameet River Basin, 52% of the homes in 2009 had made repeat flood claims. That is, you had your house damaged by a flood, and you file for insurance, and you file an insurance claim multiple times. Okay. It's not just the fact that this area has water. It's the fact of inappropriate development in an area that has all too frequent flooding. And that has been exacerbated by a trend of development. This shows the Mississippi River would be about here. This is Baton Rouge, and each of these orange blocks is a subdivision that was added. And the basic idea here is that subdivisions have pushed out since the 1970s, in particular, late 60s, 1970s, and Baton Rouge sprawl has pushed directly into the Ameet River Basin, which is not shown here, but it's basically over here to the east. Sprawl does several things. It inhibits drainage. Every culvert, every building, every road slows down the flow of runoff. Yet at the same time, every building, every parking lot, every driveway sheds more water, so you have more water, more runoff. So you have a combination of more water and impediments to drainage. And also with development, you have more people and more property at risk. And that development has grown where? Directly into the area where we see the worst flooding. Central here has something like 80% of the city limits in the 100-year floodplain. Something like 70% of the homes in Central endured damage last year. So it's not just a freak rain event, it's a long-term process of developing into an area that then sees a very high rainfall event, but one that's not truly as rare as some try to portray it. Also, another measure of inappropriate development, this shows the very first FEMA estimates of the number of damaged properties. Those that had minor damage only had 3 inches of damage or water. Those with minor had 18 to 3 inches of water, and those that were considered major damage had over 18 inches. What's important here is that these houses that had less than 18 inches, less than 1.5 feet of water, all those would have been above floodwater had they employed traditional pier construction. I have a house that's built on piers. Most of New Orleans houses, older houses, are built on piers, usually 2 to 3 feet above street level, above grade. All these houses, 75,000 houses would not have had damage had they been employing sensible construction. They could have been where they are, but they were inappropriately built. In terms of this inland flooding, what we've seen is problems have been associated with permitting floodplain development without flood-proof construction. We've seen mitigation planned but not completed. And then we've seen rebuilding and reconstruction in repeat flood areas. And actually, since the flood, we've seen a relaxation of requirements for floodplains. We've seen development in areas that were flooded in we've seen permitting of development in areas that were flooded in 2016, and we've also seen a downgrading of houses that were originally designated as substantially damaged to now, from in Baton Rouge, from 3,200 to only 187. That is, houses that had substantial damage, which means they have to be demolished or elevated. That was downgraded from 3,200 to under 200. So people can rebuild in the same way, in the same place, and be subject to flooding again in the future. Finally, our coastal crisis. This is a slow onset event. It's a large-scale crisis sweeping much of the coast, particularly the southeastern part of the state. We've had a series of state plans addressing this. So there is a long-term recovery plan, but we're in the midst of the recovery. We're building the airplane as it's flying, as our old chancellor used to like to say. Some of the recovery solutions that have been proposed are diversions, levees, wetland drainage, and marsh creation. These are all things that none of these are particularly new. The Atchafalaya Basin or the Atchafalaya floodway is a diversion. It's a technology we've been dealing with since the 1930s in Louisiana. Levees we've been dealing with since the 1700s. Wetland drainage since the 1910s. Marsh creation is a relatively new process. But if you look at just one of these, the diversions, the one that's proposed, and actually we're moving forward with the more detailed planning on, is the Mid-Barataria diversion, which will divert water from the Mississippi into the Upper Barataria Basin. And this is a picture from the Times-Picayune. That water will be diverted into an area with some of the highest density of oyster leases. These brownish areas are oyster leases. So it'll be diverting water into some of the one of the most dense concentration of oil leases in the state. We've seen lawsuits in the past because of diversions and lawsuits. We've seen the Atchafalaya and the Bonnie Carey both impact marine life and oyster life when they've been used in the past. So this is a technology we know what will happen. And they're taking steps to minimize the impacts. But this is a technology that doesn't resolve all problems, is the basic point here. So we're continuing to rely on methods like levees that have, and diversions that have produced new problems, not unknown problems. And they're compounding the existing crisis, and actually that will eventually extend the recovery process of this coastal crisis. So, by way of conclusion, As I look at these events, I see a failure really to sustain lessons learned. We've taken steps, we have not perpetuated, and when we do that, when we fail to sustain lessons learned, we perpetuate social vulnerabilities. Those people that are in harm's way tend to remain in harm's way. It extends the subsequent recovery times and the costs, because it simply costs more to restore more houses and lives and schools and other buildings. And it contributes to an overlapping of recoveries. And that produces competition for funding, and which are scarce in these fiscal times. So the real challenge becomes, how do we sustain the lessons learned and enhance resilience? And I think one comment I'd like to close on is in response to Liz's comment earlier. We tend to think of Louisiana's war with water, but I think we need to think about it as not as we don't really have a war with water, but we shouldn't. We should think about having a war with inappropriate development in harm's way. Thank you.
So our next presenter is Rebecca Costa.
Hello, can you guys hear me? Okay, hello. I'm Dr. Rebecca Costa. I'm very happy to be here today. I'm going to read you a paper that I wrote. Some of it is based on the research that I did for my dissertation at Louisiana State University. As Liz mentioned, I wrote about policies of loss and the policies and practices that contributed to coastal erosion in Louisiana during the 20th and early 21st century. The name Also, I just want to go ahead and let you guys know I am from Alabama, and even though I have lived in Louisiana for the last 8 years, I still can't quite pronounce all of the terms. So if I accidentally don't correctly pronounce it, please forgive me. I have tried to improve my Alabama accent, but it is still a struggle. The title of my paper is called Wetlands, Drylands, the connection between flood control, land use, and coastal erosion. Since the colonial period, the history of water in Louisiana has been one of control, or perhaps more precisely, the history of water in the state during the last several hundred years has been one where humans have sought to transform lands that were frequently wet into spaces that were more suitable for agriculture, urban expansion, or industrial growth. And then to keep those newly dried lands from becoming inundated as much as possible. While our sometimes impressive engineering feats have seemingly reduced flooding in southeastern Louisiana, we have also created a much larger problem in the long run. Flood control structures such as the levees that run along the Mississippi River or that shield communities from the Gulf of Mexico have caused significant alterations to the region's deltaic processes. And the coastal wetlands that once served as an important buffer against storm surge and flooding are rapidly disappearing. Starting with European colonists in the 18th century, humans have spent a significant amount of time and energy trying to tame the Mississippi River. The French abandoned settlements in 1700 and 1707 due to repeated inundations, but they finally managed to establish permanent posts in 1714 and 1716 on the periphery of the marshlands because those areas weren't as exposed to severe flooding. Then, in 1718, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne founded New Orleans on a natural levee that had been created by the Mississippi River. What is today the French Quarter was the highest the highest land in the area and offered better protection from the flooding. Additionally, landowners began constructing levees to keep the river from inundating their properties. And by 1726, artificial structures ranging in height from 4 to 6 feet surrounded the city. The Spanish and the Americans continued the French policy of building levees to contain the river and protect settlements such as New Orleans. By 1858, property owners and local authorities had built a network of levees that consisted of over 1,000 miles on both sides of the Mississippi River. The Civil War interrupted levee construction in Louisiana and ultimately caused a significant amount of damage to the existing system. After Reconstruction, the state of Louisiana and eventually, very reluctantly, the federal government continued building or improving the levees along the river. Until the early 20th century, however, federal officials maintained that the national interest in the Mississippi River was navigation, not flood control. But that attitude changed in the 19-teens. When a series of devastating floods in 1912, 1913, and 1916 resulted in millions of dollars of damages, pro-flood control forces finally convinced Congress to commit to building levees expressly for the purpose of reducing flooding along the river. The Flood Control Act of 1917 provided up to $45 million for flood control levees and required states to match federal spending. A decade later, the federal government found itself committing even greater resources to flood control for the Mississippi. In 1927, severe rains during the winter and spring eventually sent the river spilling across the delta, inundating communities from Missouri to Louisiana. Over the course of several months, the river flooded 16 million acres, destroyed 41,000 buildings, and displaced at least 600,000 people. Between 250 and 500 individuals lost their lives. Congress had held hearings in the wake of the disaster and listened to some 300 witnesses. They sifted through dozens of proposals looking for better flood control practices. After a rather intense debate, Congress and President Calvin Coolidge agreed to enact a flood control plan put forth by the Chief of Engineers for the U.S. Army, Major General Edgar Jadwin. His proposal upheld the importance of levees, but acknowledged other measures should be employed to control flooding along the Mississippi. On May 15th, I believe while he was in the middle of eating his lunch, President Coolidge signed the Flood Control Act of 1928, which authorized the implementation of flood control measures based on the chief engineer's proposal. The Jadwin Plan, which became known as the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, was the basis for federal flood control policy after 1928. Though alterations did occur as the Army of Engineers proceeded in its task of trying to tame the river. Between 1932 and 1935, the agency added plans to construct cutoffs to straighten out the Mississippi and to encourage its waters to flow more rapidly down the main channel. Two major outlets were built between 1929 and 1953, the Bonnet Carey Spillway in St. Charles Parish and the Morganza Spillway in Point Coupee Parish. Construction continued on the levees and other flood control structures through the rest of the 20th century, and by 2011, 89% of the project had been completed. Over 2,200 miles of levees flanked the Mississippi River, and another 1,500 miles ran along backwaters, tributaries, and spillways. Now, inundation from the Mississippi has not been the only problem that residents in Louisiana have had to deal with since the French began colonizing the area. Hurricanes or tropical storms have resulted in severe flooding by bringing heavy rains or storm surge into communities such as New Orleans. Prior to the 20th century, local authorities would issue storm warnings and advise people not to venture out into the storm, but hurricane preparation was largely left to individuals and businesses. Buildings tended to be located on the landscape's natural ridges, and houses were more frequently elevated from the ground. The lower-lying areas that surrounded New Orleans remained mostly unsettled, and a larger barrier of wetlands than currently exists provided another buffer for the city. Instances of mass casualties were relatively rare and more likely to occur on barrier islands such as Grand Isle than in New Orleans itself. However, after a particularly devastating hurricane in 1915, communities began shifting the responsibility of preparation from individuals to local authorities. This transition came just as the city was expanding into those lower-lying marsh areas near Lake Pontchartrain. And several major storms in the late 1940s and 1950s resulted in flooding and severe property damage in the city. In 1954, the federal government authorized a survey of hurricane threats for the eastern United States and the Gulf states. In 1962, the Corps released an initial draft for improving hurricane protection, not just preparation anymore, but protection, around Lake Pontchartrain. Yet before Congress could act, Hurricane Betsy struck Louisiana in 1965. The storm caused severe flooding and approximately $1 billion in damages to locations in southeastern Louisiana, including Grand Isle, New Orleans, St. Bernard, and Plaquemines Parish. And 80 people also lost their lives. The devastation from Betsy resulted in greater involvement by the federal government regarding hurricane protection, and Congress directed $250 million towards strengthening the levees around New Orleans. The Flood Control Act of 1965 authorized the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity Hurricane Protection Project to improve protection of the areas close to the lake's tidal basin. Construction of the Lake Pontchartrain system proceeded slowly over the next several decades due to complications with cost sharing, engineering challenges, environmental concerns, and disputes between the Corps and local partners over procuring rights of way. When Hurricane Katrina struck the Gulf Coast in 2005, completion rates for this system varied anywhere from 60 to 90%. There are several other hurricane protection networks, including in southern Louisiana, including the New Orleans to Venice system and the West Bank system. These were constructed in southeastern Louisiana during the post-Betsy era as well, and they were originally intended to protect populated areas in Orleans, Jefferson, St. Bernard, and Plaquemines Parish. The completion rate for New Orleans to Venice was approximately 80% in 2004, but there was relatively limited progress on the West Bank for nearly 20 years. Disputes between local officials in Jefferson Parish and the Corps during the 1980s resulted in extensive delays and minimal construction. Furthermore, authorities in St. Charles petitioned to be included into the West Bank during the 1990s because the parish had originally been left out of the Corps' plans. When Katrina came on shore, the West Bank system sustained significant damage and did not offer as much protection as, of course, locals had hoped. Now, upon assessing the efficacy of overall flood control, or overall efficacy of flood control in southeastern Louisiana and along other portions of the Mississippi, I think we can say the results have been mixed. Certainly, levees and flood control mechanisms such as drainage pumps have reduced flooding events in communities, but the limitations of these structures have been on display multiple times during the last several decades. Perhaps most infamously, long-term systemic problems with the hurricane protection levees contributed to the inundation of New Orleans following Hurricane Katrina. Major floods on the Mississippi River occurred in 1973, 1993, and 2011. And they all caused widespread devastation. In fact, in 1973, the old river control structure nearly failed. The 1993 failed, caused some $15 billion in damages. Now, worse, right, a sort of long-term problem, these levees, particularly the levees around the Mississippi, have contributed to the erosion of Louisiana's coastline during the last 80 years. Humans have largely successfully managed to cut the river off from its delta in the pursuit of flood control. As a result, the wetlands that make up a considerable portion of southeastern Louisiana's landscape have withered and died as the fresh water and sediments that nourished them disappeared. Between 1932 and 2010, the state of Louisiana experienced a net loss of land that totaled 1,883 square miles. Despite ongoing attempts to repair the state's vanishing swamps and marshes, the prognosis for the coastal wetlands is presently rather grim. If the state takes no additional actions to restore the coast, authors of the 2017 update to the master plan estimate that Louisiana will lose another 2,250 square miles of land by 2067. Now, there are multiple factors that have contributed to the loss of wetlands, including the engineering of the Mississippi. But I think one factor that we should consider, I think one factor that's quite important and something that Dr. Colton was hinting or discussing, this factor of land use. In regard to both the rivers levees and the hurricane protection levees, these structures were built with the intention of protecting residences, businesses, and infrastructure from the damage that comes along with flooding. And this connection between land use and flood control has been present since the colonial period in Louisiana. Indeed, one of the reasons that the French had such a challenging time adapting to the rhythms of the Delta was that the regular flooding of the Mississippi River and the large patches of swamps and marshes made pursuing European-style agriculture quite difficult. Success with growing rice crops around the time New Orleans was founded made survival in the region more feasible, but the French consistently struggled to produce sufficient amounts of food. The construction of levees stemmed in part from the desire to create a dry environment that allowed for traditional European agriculture as well as stable stationary settlements. Americans, once they began moving into the region after the Louisiana Purchase, Americans also found that these wetlands of southern Louisiana were not particularly accommodating to their vision of what a proper, meaning dry, landscape should look like. In fact, writers and thinkers in the mid-19th century often spoke of dry lands and the related act of agriculture as not just being morally desirable, but also beneficial to democracy. That mindset was evident in the mid-19th century when representatives from Louisiana were part of a sustained effort in Congress that resulted in the passage of the 1849 Swamplands Act. Speaking of the impact that the drainage of the state's swamps and marshes could have in Louisiana, a member from the House of Representatives Committee on Public Lands asserted, quote, "When it is found that these rich lands can be cultivated without risk of life or health, it does not require the gift of prophecy to foretell that they will be immediately settled by an industrious and enterprising population, who will soon transform the tangled forests and gloomy canebrakes into fruitful fields and smiling gardens," end quote. The bill passed easily, especially with that sort of sentiment, and transferred the federally owned swamplands to the state government, which officials could then sell to private interests at low prices. Furthermore, the revenues that were generated from the sale of these swamplands would be used to fund levee construction along the Mississippi River. So not only did the Swampland Act encourage the transformation of wetlands into dry lands, the legislation also included a mechanism to help keep those newly reclaimed lands, those newly dried lands, from becoming inundated in the future. Another example of the connection between land use and flood control was related to the Mississippi River and Tributaries Project. As levee construction proceeded through the middle of the 20th century, the Corps added another project to help control the river's waters. For several decades after the 1927 flood, there were a growing number of concerns that the Mississippi was going to abandon its main channel for the Atchafalaya River. The Corps and the Mississippi River Commission devised a plan in 1955 to keep the river from switching channels and also to make use of the Atchafalaya as an outlet for floodwaters. The Old River Control Structure, which was completed in 1963, was designed to direct all of the water from the Red River and 25% of the water from the Mississippi into the Atchafalaya. Later that same year, the Corps dammed up the Old River and cut it off from the Mississippi. Efforts to keep the river on its current path were related partly in fears to the decline of water that was moving down the main channel. If that decline continued, officials were concerned that that would lead to a buildup of sediments and thus raise the flood heights. Additionally, officials were concerned that if the Mississippi did jump channels, that scenario would have been devastating for the economies of Baton Rouge and New Orleans, both of which have industries that depend on occupying land that is accessible to the river. The connection between land use and flood control can be seen in respect to the hurricane protection systems as well. For example, the flood control of 1965, which authorized the Lake Pontchartrain and Vicinity Project, specifically stated that one of the purposes of the levees was to improve the protection of 502,000 acres of, quote, developed and developable land from hurricane-induced flooding, end quote. During the 1970s, officials in Jefferson Parish petitioned the Corps to expand its plans for the West Bank levee system to accommodate future expansion and economic growth. Likewise, when political figures in St. Charles requested hurricane protection in the 1990s, they cited specifically the need to protect communities that had expanded off the natural levees and into the parish's lower-lying wetlands. While a few states developed stringent rules regarding land use during the 1960s and 1970s, Louisiana tended not to be overly strict concerning land use practices. Municipal governments often handled issues of zoning, while officials in Baton Rouge used the state's abundant lands and access to the Mississippi River as selling points for recruiting business. Additionally, property rights were often seen as sacred, and imposing regulations on land use was generally not a winning political position. However, after Katrina, Louisianans and the nation debated what went wrong during the storm, several discussions touched on the issues of land use in southeastern Louisiana. For example, the impacts of Katrina prompted a debate about land use in New Orleans, and there were some discussions about shrinking the amount of space that the city occupied in 2006. Planners, politicians, and the public advocated several different positions, ranging from complete abandonment to maintaining the urban footprint exactly as it was prior to the 2015 season. By the 10th anniversary of the storm, the state and municipal governments had largely embraced a policy of mitigation. And this is an approach which promotes strategies such as home elevation, improved drainage mechanisms, reduced new development in flood zones, and restoring the state's coastal wetlands. The hurricane protection levees were also expanded and moderately fortified after Hurricane Katrina, but officials and the public have mostly rejected radical changes to existing land use practices. Understanding the connection between flood control, land use, and coastal erosion is vital to the state. All three must be considered as interrelated when developing policies for coastal zone management in Louisiana, and adopting more sustainable land use patterns to lessen the need for flood control could be an integral part of restoration efforts in the future. Indeed, citizens and governments alike are going to have to make decisions about how we use our lands, since human-made flood control structures may very well become less effective in the context of a shrinking coastline and rising sea levels. In addition to repairing the deteriorating wetlands, planning for a smart, orderly retreat from certain parts of the coast would be sound public policy, particularly because livelihoods, and rich cultural histories are at stake. Ultimately, Louisiana will need more specific plans addressing land use than currently exists, as residents are likely facing a future in which reliably dry lands become increasingly wetlands. Thank you very much.
Our next presenter is Beth Stauffer.
You guys hear me if I'm here? Yeah? No? Okay, good to know. Thank you for having a biologist speak today. This is really fun. It's a different sort of event than I'm used to, and I'm excited. I had to update my slides at the last second because of formatting things. Give me 1 second. There we go. Please. Yeah, looks better. Okay, so we're going to go from land to the sea. I am a biological oceanographer, so I think in terms of things that are a bit saltier than we've been talking about so far, but an aspect of Louisiana that is really important to really what Louisiana is. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the Louisiana's special connection with the Gulf and what that means both for the water issues that we're talking about today, but also how Louisiana has become such an important economic and kind of cultural touchstone for these sorts of issues. No, maybe not. Okay. So getting a little saltier now, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. We are located on the Gulf of Mexico. So many areas where civilization and where our modern metropolitan cities are found are located next to estuaries, next to these coastal oceans. And so a lot of what I'll be talking about today is generalizable, scalable to some of the other urban areas that are experiencing issues that we are here as well. So it's not hard to look at this map of Louisiana river basins and see that there's often a very direct connection to the Gulf of Mexico. This is off, there we go. So we have certainly our South Louisiana watersheds that drain directly into the Gulf, but you can also have some more indirect connections in these northern watersheds as well. I did my graduate work in Southern California, where you see a lot of these no dumping drains directly to the Gulf stamps on the storm drains. We don't have these here, right? We don't have necessarily a sense of this direct connection to this salty coastal ocean, but it is there. You have to be forgiven for not really thinking about that. Some of our major water bodies in these watersheds move pretty slowly. We don't walk out to the coulee down the street here off Congress and immediately think of the Gulf of Mexico. Our Vermilion River, our lovely local river, is pretty slow moving, relatively speaking. If you threw something in the kind of headwaters up on the parish lines, which please don't do. We're trying to get less trash in the rivers. And kind of let that flow at an average speed. It would take 4 to 5 days to make it down to Sycamore Point, down to Vermilion Bay. So, you could be forgiven for not going out and immediately thinking of the Gulf of Mexico when you look at our local watersheds. But that connection is there. That land-to-sea connection is very strong, and we'll circle back to that in a few minutes. So the Gulf of Mexico, what is it? I'm sure most people here have been to the Gulf of Mexico or seen it or thought of it. It's what we consider a marginal sea. So it's part of the Atlantic Ocean, but it's surrounded mostly by a continent. There's different oceanography, there's different physics and currents, slightly different ecosystem processes that are occurring in this kind of set off to the side part of the Atlantic. It's pretty big, it's pretty deep. Out in the center of the Gulf, you have miles of water beneath your boat if you get out that far. And it's an area that's experiencing a lot of population growth. So from the 60s to kind of the mid-2000s, we saw 150% increase in population growth. That's expected to increase in the next 10 to 20 years even more. Again, a lot of the hubs of civilization were built up around estuaries, around deltaic systems like what we have in the Mississippi River system. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is and those the challenges that presents, but also the opportunities, the resources. So we have that land-to-sea connection, right? You go and take a sample of water in the Vermilion, that's eventually going to make it down to the Vermilion Bay. But you also have this sea-to-land connection. So some of the things that my colleagues have already discussed, storm surges associated with hurricanes. This is from the recent tropical storm Cindy, showing water that's been really pushed up into that land area from the Gulf. You have this guy's boat, which is not supposed to be in the parking lot of the marina, but rather in the water. This is a really huge amount of water, a huge amount of force, huge amount of weight that can be brought to bear that can really negatively impact, obviously, our ability to sustain events like this on land. But it's not all associated with these extreme events. Obviously, these are oftentimes the most visible, and these crazy pictures of a big shrimping boat up on a parking lot. But there are more persistent, more chronic issues related to this land-sea interface and really with this intrusion of the sea onto land. This is another example from the Calcasieu area. I also might mispronounce things, so please correct me after. I'm still learning. But you can see here that, so this is a map of Calcasieu Lake, kind of up into Lake Charles and further up. And you can see that these site numbers correspond to these different colors of basically salinity, so how much salt is in the water over different months of a year. What your eye is drawn to are these, what we consider the drier months in terms of river discharge. So July, August, September, October, where you have really, these are brackish level salinities. These salinities are what you would usually find kind of right down here in the Gulf of Mexico that are being transported all the way up to Lake Charles and further. These sorts of issues of saltwater intrusion, literally the sea intruding onto the land, have resulted in a lot of, again, our human ingenuity. Let's engineer some solutions to make that stop. Protect the wetlands that require fresher salinities, protect the agriculture and livestock that require fresh water for those endeavors. These are long-term projects. This saltwater barrier is expected to cost close to $500 million for engineering, design, construction, plus 50 years of maintenance. Those are long-term commitments, that expect that nothing will change in those next 50 years. So or very little will change in terms of the fundamental properties. So this, I think a lot of people have harkened back to Dr. Skelton's earlier comments of, the war on water, or I liked the arm wrestling analogy. It is arm wrestling, it is a war, it's also a balance. It's also this almost kind of dance between things moving from the land into the sea and vice versa. So we have this dynamic balance between water on the land, water in the ocean, and where the two meet. I'm sure many of you have seen these sorts of images, satellite images of the Mississippi River and Atchafalaya River plumes. This is how it looks from space. You can see this rich, it's rich in sediment, rich in nutrients, rich in organic matter, being transported with those freshwater flows into our coastal waters. This is the basis of the productivity of our coastal ocean. This is the basis of a lot of the resources that we are able to derive from the Gulf of Mexico. So I'm going to spend a few more minutes talking about that, and then also circle back to something I'm sure you guys have all been hearing about lately with when this becomes too much for that system. So I study plankton. This is my only mention of plankton, so anyone who was hoping for discussion of diatoms or dinoflagellates, I'll talk to you later. Basically, this is the crux of why we are sportsman's paradise, right? Why we have oftentimes flourishing coastal economies, not just in Louisiana, but worldwide in coastal systems. As you increase nitrogen, as you increase phosphorus, as you increase the same things you give your plants in your garden to grow, you stimulate growth of plankton, phytoplankton, okay, benthic algae, these marsh plants, right, these vascular plants that are not only photosynthesizing, but also creating that important wetland habitat that we just heard so much about. And we have a strong, positive, significant relationship. Add a little bit more fertilizer, get a little bit more growth. That primary production becomes the base of those food webs. We don't really go out and eat a lot of benthic algae or phytoplankton, but a lot of the things that we are interested in harvesting and using in terms of resources and supplies from the ocean are a function of that productivity. Again, it's not just Louisiana. We are, one of many of these coastal sites. You can see this is a global map of basically productivity. You can see on land where you have those dark green, rainforests, lots of vegetation. You can see hugging the coasts around the continents, right? Not out in the open oceans mostly, but these greens and oranges and reds in the coastal systems. And there we are right there, a little pocket of orange and red. This is productivity. This is the base of basically a lot of the things that we derive from the coastal zone. So I'm also not a historian, but here's a little bit of history on one of our fisheries. We have a really long, rich history in Louisiana in terms of harvesting resources from the coastal ocean. Oysters are one of those organisms that we like to harvest, that we like to eat, we like to export to other states. And really, we have a rich, long history of oyster fishing. So since the 19th century, when it emerged as a commercial fishery, really expanded in the 20th century to be fourth in the nation. In 1917, when the New Orleans population was a fraction of what it is now 100 years ago, they were consuming 750,000 bushels of oysters per year, basically taking about a third of that harvest just right in the state. But you can see that there's been also reductions in these oyster fisheries. We heard a little bit about some of the known causes of those reductions. We know that we didn't have great sustainable fishing practices kind of when a lot of this expansion was happening, so over-harvesting occurred. We're dealing with issues related to diversions, related to reduced salinity, related to warming. Those tend to intersect and have synergistic kind of additive effects on harm to the oysters. But so these are historic oyster reefs off of basically Vermilion Bay, Marsh Island in 1906 compared to today. You can see that while they're slightly different scales, we've lost a lot of the natural oyster reefs in our waters because of a variety of those, a combination of those factors. So we have a long, rich history of Louisiana fisheries. That continues to today. We're ranked basically 7th in the U.S. in terms of the number of jobs supported by the seafood industry. And this is all data from 2015, the fisheries economics study that NOAA puts out every couple of years. It's a really great source for more information on national and state trends, if you're interested. We've got about $1.8 billion in total sales that's integrating across kind of, people going out on boats to people working in seafood restaurants. But you can see that that's a pretty significant chunk of our economy. Louisiana contributes the most finfish and shellfish landings out of the Gulf states. More blue crabs are caught here than in any other state, so that crab bake up in Maryland may not actually be Maryland crab. Biggest menhaden landings come from Louisiana than any other state. Menhaden or pogie you may not see on a menu, but your dog probably does in their dog food. You probably take a supplement, or a fish you eat took a supplement. So it's one of these reduction fisheries that actually is contributing a lot to the state and national economy. And then we have a huge amount of recreational fishing, the sportsman's paradise, right? You can go out and hunt and you can fish in the wetlands. You can also go out 20, 50 miles offshore and fish for those species that spent part of their lives in the wetlands, right? That spent part of their lives at least deriving benefit from that estuarine production. But so then I'm going to kind of end a little bit of my talk on another side of that balance, that delicate balance. So we have this great productivity from those nutrients, that organic matter that's being delivered to our coastal ocean. But as we all know, too much of a good thing can give you, health problems. So we have a health problem in our coastal ocean. This made news just about a month ago, and so we'll talk a little bit about kind of this year's scenario. But as we follow this, inorganic nitrogen production curve further to the right, it doesn't just keep going up in a good way, right? We end up with more production than can be taken out by the consumers, and we end up with dead zones or hypoxic waters, especially in the Gulf of Mexico. This is a schematic just describing that process. When we talk about dead zones, we're usually talking about bottom waters, so kind of below a transition zone that are kind of trapped and that are not devoid, but very depleted or devoid of oxygen. It's stimulated, again, by that excess nutrient runoff, again, kind of out on this right side of the graph, more than really we can sustain in these systems. Growth is stimulated, that those primary producers are not eaten necessarily, but they sink, they decompose. That decomposition is really what draws the oxygen out of the system. That water gets trapped, and basically, if you're an animal that can move, you do. If you're an animal that cannot move, so a shellfish or small worms, some of the smaller little critters, they tend to die. So it tends to be a pretty significant ecological event, but we'll talk about how it becomes a significant economic event as well. We can predict the size of this dead zone each year based on basically nitrogen concentrations coming out of the Mississippi River. It is a pretty direct tie to nitrogen loading in that system. And it occurs every summer, basically, since it's been studied since the 70s and 80s. This year's dead zone is the largest on record in the Gulf of Mexico. They started measuring the aerial extent, so going out and basically doing research cruises in this area, measuring oxygen and mapping those hypoxic bottom waters. And you can see I've kind of tacked on the 2017 area to the right here. It's in excess of any of the previously measured levels. It's the size of New Jersey, so we have kind of a garden state of very little oxygen off of our coast. It's in excess of kind of that most recent 5-year average. It's in excess of what the Hypoxia Task Force, a national interagency, multi-state body, set as an action plan goal many years ago. So we're nowhere near solving this issue. It's not just Louisiana. So again, we benefit from all the coastal resources. We also overload those coastal systems with too much of that good thing. And so these are global trends in the number of reported hypoxic sites worldwide. This is kind of a graphical representation, so a map showing yellow our eutrophic system, so where you have excess nutrients, but you may not have hypoxia yet. Red is where you have those hypoxic sites. And then this is data from the USGS showing, where's all this nitrogen and phosphorus coming from? Again, Louisiana, we benefit from those coastal resources. We are suffering the consequences of too much of those nutrients. We're often not the source of those nutrients, so most of the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus are being delivered from the Mississippi River watershed, Most of the nitrogen, a lot of the phosphorus are coming from crops. A fair bit of the phosphorus is also coming from livestock and pasture. And so just to kind of make that last connection to the impacts on economics, on culture, on really our relationship with the Gulf, when you have these dead zones, when we have our dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, you often see reductions in a lot of those fisheries that rely on those bottom waters. So brown shrimp, they live basically at the bottom of the water by the sediment. And you see a significant and negative relationship. Increasing hypoxia area, decreasing shrimp landings, the amount of shrimp that are brought back to the shore. You also end up with more burden on fishermen, right? If they have to go out further to fish, if they have to go to different sites, that changes a lot of their economics. A lot of times they're kind of small businessmen who have pretty narrow profit margins. If they have to go another 20, 50 miles off or east-west, that can have significant impacts on their ability to do that job. It's a huge part of cultural identity when you're a fisherman or a shrimper. Pretty significant impacts there. And then there are economic impacts. So as landings go down, prices change. As different size shrimp, for example, survive hypoxia more or kind of can get out of it, you often have a shift to smaller shrimp. Who wants to go buy smaller shrimp? Nobody. So the cost ratios, the economics, the dollars that those shrimpers see in their pockets change as well. So we really have this dynamic balance between water that's on land, making it to the Gulf, whether that's originating in Louisiana or it's coming through Louisiana from other parts of the country. We have this dynamic balance between our reliance and our what we benefit from in harvesting those resources and enjoying those resources. Cultural identity is tied up to your father and your father's father being oystermen. There's a lot of that you hear in the state of Louisiana. And so we're really dealing with this struggle between we need a healthy coastal ecosystem to support healthy coastal communities, but we have to really balance those two things. So my concluding thoughts are trying to tie it back to really the discussion here today about primarily water on land. And we have a lot of needs to deal with extreme flooding, to deal with hurricane events, to deal with all of these extreme events in a better way, the coastal land loss issue. But we also have to make sure we're balancing these healthy food webs and these healthy coastal ecosystems as well. Knowing what the effects of diversions are on oysters is one step. We have to expand that to be more inclusive and integrative in looking at this Gulf ecosystem as part of our coastal and urban even community. So thank you.
Well, I couldn't have planned that panel better myself. in terms of coming together, in terms of themes of thinking about living and water and what that means. I'm sure you all have questions for Drs. Colton, Costa, and Stauffer, so I'd like to open it up to question and answer. Anybody? So, all the way in the back.
You both touched on the importance of smart land use planning, and so I was wondering if you know of any entities that are doing that work of trying to figure out like more specific solutions and ways that we can like just make better plans.
I can offer a few thoughts and pass it back to Rebecca. Certainly the Dutch have been advancing this notion of learning to live with water for quite a number of years now, making room for the river, all these various ideas about rather than battling the river, how do you accommodate the river, how do you have what they call in the coast managed retreat. There are any number of things, although we don't like to talk about retreat here in Louisiana. But there are ways you can do this. And there are actually a number of things that have been tried and advanced and advocated for New Orleans and coastal Louisiana that have been summarily rejected. So just in terms of New Orleans, after Katrina, they had the famous green dot map, where they said, let's have these areas that endure the greatest flooding, declare those areas that they can serve as flood retention basins in the future. And we do this all over the country in terms of you have parks in flood-prone areas. So that's an accepted practice. But New Orleans rejected because people wanted the right to return, and I can understand that. But if we had slightly densified the safer areas, the higher elevated areas, you could have had the same population base in New Orleans without the risk. So how do you transform a city from exposing people to risk to one to where you protect them from risk? It's a fundamental question.
Hello, can you hear me? This may sort of answer your question. I was going to mention the green sort of dots in New Orleans. It's the only thing I can think of. And this gets to your question, too. I think one of the things that we can do as the public is to put more pressure on our political representatives, particularly in terms of things like the National Flood Insurance Program. It's currently $25 million in debt. There are 11,000 severe repetitive lost properties in the United States. I think there's a house in Baton Rouge that has flooded 50 times. There's a house in Houston that has, it's worth about $75,000, but it's had $1 million worth of claims. And so we have, this is one of the things that we've done to facilitate unsmart, non-smart growth is to have this program, right, where we subsidize risk. And there have been attempts and discussions about reforming the National Flood Insurance Program, but people tend to call their representatives very angrily when they find out that there's going to be premium hikes. And so this is not just, organizations that have to do things to improve land growth. This is all our land use. This is also on the public as well. And one of those things is accepting that we live in a high-risk area and we are going to have to help pay for it. So I don't know if that answers your question as well.
I had a question for Dr. Stauffer. On your graph with the relationship of primary producers to dissolved inorganics, I was wondering where the maximum limit of dissolved inorganics is for, I guess, a sustainable Gulf and a sustainable Gulf ecosystem, and what it would take to get there.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a very generalized graph. So you could go down to, marsh plants have a curve that tapers off in terms of how much nitrogen is enough, and then excess is just going to fuel whatever. But basically, that's where that line was drawn. So that hypoxia task force recommendation of where the hypoxic area should be was basically based on calculations of how much nitrogen we can handle in the system that basically grows, gets consumed, and doesn't lead to this buildup of production. I'm not remembering what the actual loads are right now. It's a function of concentration plus basically discharge, so wet years, dry years, it changes. But it's a significant reduction that's required. And part of the reason that people give for why we haven't gotten there is that the producers, the sources of that nitrogen are largely unregulated. Unlike the Chesapeake Bay, where they've put into place total maximum daily loads, basically nutrient diets, and they've been able to get most of the way there by doing things like wastewater treatment plant upgrades. This isn't that system. So we have we have non-point sources that are largely unregulated, and so setting targets is great. We need policy, basically, that gets us there.
This question is for Beth Stauffer as well. I fear I know the answer, unfortunately. That is the cure for the dead zones. We think of one of the big contributions, the visible contributions to the Gulf of Mexico from the east are winds, water, hurricanes, but I fear that their effect is strictly atmospheric and maybe limited to the surf. We don't expect anything to generate a flushing activity that would help out the dead zones, right?
Yeah. I mean, the physics of the Gulf are. You're right. The physics of the Gulf are basically you have water coming in from the south and kind of the east and doing a little loop and then going back out through the Straits of Florida. And yeah, I mean, you're not going to have huge flushing events unless you have big storm events, which you actually do see disruptions and shrinking of those hypoxic areas when you have a big storm comes through, right? Mixes it up, reoxygenates the water column. We have to fundamentally limit the amount of that stimulating nutrient that's getting into the water, because we're never really going to have the flushing, and you can't go down and bubble the Gulf of Mexico, which is what you would do in like a lake or something.
Feared as much.
I have a question for Dr. Stauffer as well. Are there any policies being implemented by big agriculture to combat their contributions to the dead zone, specifically nitrogen?
Yeah, I didn't learn this in oceanography, but when I was at the EPA, there's a lot of people certainly with the EPA, and there's a lot of people with USDA, which is kind of the main agency working with producers, who are trying to work together on this. There's a fundamental tension there, right? We have a lot of policy that protects farming and that protects the agricultural industry in our country because, hey, we need to feed people, right? And we need to produce, crops for other uses. And so there is a delicate tension there that people are trying to work on. There are a lot of good ideas out there, none of which seem to have really been put into practice. A lot of market-driven incentives, so maybe instead of regulation, so some big companies like Walmart or Unilever have started implementing supply chain sustainability metrics. If you can include water quality parts of that, right, that you're putting in less than a certain amount of nitrogen, or they're doing it with climate change too, because excess nitrogen is released into the atmosphere as well and is a greenhouse gas. So, there are some innovative options out there, but they haven't quite gotten to that point yet. And so, it's a big challenge, and we need good people working on it. So, if it interests you, yeah.
All right, well, we have scheduled a break in between this session and the next session. Please join me in thanking Dr. Colton, Dr. Costa, and Dr. Stauffer for their comments. I am sure that they would be willing to talk with you more as we take our coffee break. So we'll see you back here at 10:45.